Day. If you've ever wondered about somebody's intelligence, innovation, creativity, compassion, resilience, knowledge, humor, integrity, and intellect, ask them if they're a teacher. And from a teacher myself to the core to all the teachers who are joining us today, you are the heartbeat of education. We'll be here celebrating with you for 3 days with no less than 18 webinars. And this is our first plenary session for this celebration, Reflections on the Future of English with Michael Connolly. Michael, how are you today?
I'm very good, Hala. How are you?
I'm good. Where are you speaking to us from today?
I'm in London.
Great, great city, great plenary speech for this morning. So let me tell our audience a little bit about you, Michael. So Michael is the British Council Director of English and School Education. Michael began his career in 1998 in Japan, working as a language assistant, and has since worked in a variety of teacher training, and academic management roles in Spain, in Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, the occupied Palestinian territories, and India. So we're very happy and delighted to have you, Michael, today. And I think we're ready to start if you are. So if you're ready, you can start sharing your slides, Michael, and I'll turn off my camera. I'll be around if you need me. And I wish everybody who's joining us to enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Hala. I'm absolutely delighted to be opening up this special World Teachers' Day conference. As you can see in the background, it's a very special year for the British Council. It's our 90th year. And I suppose when I'm thinking about reflections on the future of English, I'm also thinking about the past. I'm thinking about the 90 years of the British Council and also my own career in education. So what I'm going to talk about today, um, first of all, I'm going to start by looking at the past, reflections on early educational experiences. I'm going to look at some research that the British Council has conducted some years ago, English Next, and in the last few years, the future of English. I'll have a little look at one aspect of the future of English, which is around the role of technology. And then finally, some general reflections, thinking back on my career and my experience in education and topics that are raised in the future of English. So, before I start, I'll just sort of think I'm in a reflective mood. I think everyone at the British Council is 90 years, the future of English publication. And it makes me think back about my own career. I started, as Hala mentioned, as in the British Council over 20 years ago. But my journey in education goes back more than 45 years when I started primary school. So I suppose I've been in education for half the lifetime of the British Council. Um, Actually, that's probably a bad start. I'm beginning to feel very old as soon as I said that. But as Hannah mentioned, it's been a really fascinating journey. Many countries around the world. I'm delighted to see lots of teachers from countries that I worked in, from Japan to Jordan to Palestine to Egypt, Morocco. It's wonderful to see you in particular. And like all of us and on this call, probably I've spent most of my life in education, from primary school and secondary school and university. I was a language assistant, a teacher educator, managing teacher educator programs. And today I have the real privilege of managing our global programs around the world. And I suppose I've also continued to be a learner. And like everyone involved in this call, it's been a continuous professional journey. So I've been a teacher and a learner probably all of my life. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of nostalgia. Um, so I'm going to look back and give you a second. You can put your answers in the chat here. Who was your first teacher and what was your first school like? Just put your observations in the chat. Just to say from me, my first teacher was a lady called Mrs. Black. And she was a wonderful teacher, though quite a traditional teacher. What was my first school like? It was a small rural school. We had two classrooms and two teachers, and that was it. So that was my first experience. How about you? There's a really interesting answer. Someone said my first teacher was my parents. Um, let's have a look. Rajiv talks about Mrs. Annie. That's in Columbus School. Hala has talked about Miss Fatma. And Rad was talking about how amazing her school was. So I'll have a look at what was my first school like. Um, First of all, I mentioned that I went to a small school, a rural school. I lived in an isolated rural community. So I suppose for me, my first school was a window to the world. Um, I didn't know much about cities. I hadn't traveled around the world. So school was where I really learned about the rest of the world. I remember our geography lessons and looking at the atlas and thinking about all the places I could go. I remember access to the library. We didn't have many books at home, so the library at school was a real window to the world. And in particular, the encyclopedias we had in the school, we didn't have anything like that at home. It was also my first introduction to technology. And sometimes that was quite basic. And looking back on it, like the calculator, we were obsessed by calculators at school, our first real use of technology. And the first time I ever used a computer was at the end of primary school. I'm not sure if I used it. We had a computer in the school. I'm not sure if we were allowed to touch it, but we were allowed to look at it at least. Um, I mentioned there were only two teachers and only two classrooms, but there were seven grades in the school, seven grades of primary school. So it was multi-level. You had many kids from the ages of 5 to 9 in one classroom and then 10 to 11 in the other classroom. So it was multi-level and very much mixed ability. And all of the kids from the local community came to that school. It was very teacher centered. The teacher was the boss. The children, on the whole, were encouraged to be quiet. I can't remember speaking very much. And when we did speak, we were disciplined. So it was very teacher centered. The teacher was a great teacher, but quite traditional, as I mentioned. It was a relatively large class size, considering the size of the school, each class containing all of the students. And there was a big emphasis on rote learning and times tables, which some of you might remember. And we learned a lot of songs and prayers and a lot of things that I've never forgotten to this day, actually. I remember a lot of that. But the focus was more perhaps on memorization than understanding. And we had some bilingual approaches. I come from Ireland and my first language is English, but we also spoke Irish in the classroom. And the teacher used classroom instructions and so on were in the Irish language. And again, this was we didn't necessarily understand all of it, but I still remember to this day, all of my Irish comes from when I was 5, 6 years old. And the school was very inclusive in some respects, in that all the kids from the local community came to the same school. And there were, in retrospect, many of the children had special educational needs and they were integrated into the school and into the classroom. But I would say that there wasn't much acknowledgement of those needs, and the teacher didn't particularly pay much attention to those needs. And perhaps kids who had those needs were often seen as slightly slow learners, for example, and not really encouraged to exploit their full potential. And there was also a little bit of corporal punishment. If you were a bad boy, which I frequently was, the teacher might slap you. Um, and that wasn't very nice. And then a thing I thought about it is, all of that sounds extremely traditional, but my father told me that when Mr. and Mrs. Black, the two teachers, came to our community, they were the first teachers to bring a modern pedagogy to our local community, maybe 20 years before I went to school. So they were very modern in their approach, perhaps in the 1960s. But by the time it came to me being at school, that already had seemed quite traditional and outdated. So that was my experience in school in the late 1970s and early 80s. And I think a lot of this, depending on where you live, might be quite familiar. And this is the case for many kids. Even today, this kind of education is quite familiar. So thinking about the past, I want to turn now to the future. So I think it's very important to reflect, before we look at the future of what we do, it's very important to look at the past. One of the things in my learning experience at university, I was a history student, and I know from that that you can't really understand or think about the future unless you look back at your past. And this is a publication that the British Council did in 2006 by the late David Graddle, and it was called English Next. And David was looking at it was a really far-sighted book, Futurology, looking at what the future of the British Council might be 15 years later. And he came up with 12 predictions about the future of English. I've just put three of them on the screen. And again, it'd be nice to hear your comments on those predictions. Um, did they come true? Was David correct? So the first thing that he said was the economic advantage of English is ebbing away, that English will become less important and less competitive because it will be a near universal basic skill. So what David was suggesting was that everywhere around the world, children will be learning English as a basic skill in school education, and therefore the advantage of knowing English would be less because everyone can speak it, or most people can speak it. And I'd like to know what you think. Do you think he was right? And we can come back to that in the questions. Do you think it's not as important because so many people speak it? I think, like many of David's predictions, it was far-sighted and partly true. I think it's more and more people speak English, so I suppose it's less of a specialist skill, and perhaps it's less important to speak English than to be multilingual, for example, and to speak a number of global languages. But English is still very important, and it still has many advantages in many societies and economies, for international mobility and for access to information. So it remains very important. Speaking of information, David suggested with the growth of other languages on the internet at the time that English on the internet will decline, and there will be much use of other languages. So when David was writing, the internet was, almost entirely English dominated, and he predicted that that would change. And again, I think he's largely correct. If you look at the internet today, it's on every language in the world. But it's still disproportionately a lot of information on the internet, a lot of information in beyond that in things like academic research and so on. English remains slightly dominant and disproportionate to the number of speakers of the English language. But the great news is the internet is much more diverse in content and linguistically than it used to be when David was writing his predictions. And then lastly, and this one's always a controversial one, which we might come back to at the end, he thought that native speakers as teachers would become irrelevant. Um, Native speaker norms less relevant. And why is that? Well, because most people are learning English in school education. They're being taught by local teachers and not necessarily by native speakers of English. Um, when David was writing, I think there was a much more emphasis on the um, um, importance of native speaker models and native speaker teachers in private language schools and so on. And this has definitely changed. The majority of English teachers in the world are not native speakers, and the majority of English speakers in the world shouldn't be native speakers. And most of the English that we use around the world is not between native speakers, it's between people who have learned English as an additional language. And to me, um, I think native speaker teaching is irrelevant, and he was right. What's important is to be a good teacher, not whether you spoke it as your first language. So at the British Council, we were looking at David and thinking about his predictions. And initially, we thought, well, let's come up with some new predictions 15 years after his original publication. But we realized, talking to people around the world, and teachers and educators and people from business and students and so on, we realized that perhaps we shouldn't be making predictions like David did, but perhaps we should be asking questions. And I'm sure many of you have heard about our publication, The Future of English, Global Perspectives. I think this came out, oh, maybe it's 2 years ago. I can't quite remember now. I think it was 2 years ago, but Future of English is an ongoing research project by the British Council. And you can see here the link and the code if you haven't seen this yet. So instead of making predictions, we looked at some questions about the future of English. And over the coming years, we'll be involved in a dialogue and research projects trying to address these questions with people in every continent and countries around the world. So I'll focus on one of them in particular, but I'll have a quick look at some of them. For example, the first one, will English remain the world's most sought after language? Um, I would guess, like all languages, in the very long term, it won't be. No doubt it will change. In the past, we've had different dominant languages from Latin to French to Spanish to, it's changed over the years. And no doubt at some point in the distant future, English will not be the most sought after language. But at the moment, it's still very dominant. And we sort of suggest in the future of English that that will probably remain the case for the next 10 years anyway. Another important question is around the role English will play in our multilingual reality. So something that I mentioned at the beginning is that it might be less important to speak English than it is to speak a number of languages in an increasingly multilingual world. And much of the world was always multilingual. Um, English and English speakers tend to be um, predominantly monolingual in the UK, for example, but in many countries around the world, there has been a multilingual reality for forever. I remember I lived in India for a few years, and I was amazed at people sometimes speaking 4 or 5 different languages in their everyday lives. And you could hear 4, 5, 6 languages within a single classroom, and how exciting this was. And that's generally not the case in the UK, where English is perhaps people tend to monolingualism. Um, One other one to talk about, which I'll come back to at the end, is the English as a medium of education. This is growing around the world and particularly in higher education, where people are looking at the internationalization of the curriculum, which often means the teaching of the curriculum through the medium of English. And this has always been the case in some parts of the world in primary education and secondary education, but is increasing across the piece. Um, this is some worrying aspects, the growth of English as a medium of education. Often there is little evidence that learning other subjects through English either improves your English or improves your knowledge of those subjects. And there's problems in many countries around the world with the growth of English as a medium of education, where perhaps the children cannot understand the language of instruction, and the teachers may not have the language proficiency to teach the curriculum. So these are some of the questions. I might come back to them at the end and thinking about in the summary of my reflections, but I'm going to focus just on one of them. We have a short session. So about technology, and a very important question: can technology narrow the equity gap in English language education? So again, I'm going to ask for your comments. I'll try to keep up with them. When did you first use technology in the classroom, and what was it that you used? So I'll just give you a second to put in any comments you have. What was the first technology you used in the classroom? We've got Kirsty talking about a smart whiteboard, Militia, a projector, a smart whiteboard, and Ida talks about PowerPoint, Elaf, a speaker. Yes, of course, that's technology, speaker. Um, Ibrahim, he's used a data show, and only last year, Yabo used a Bluetooth speaker. So lots of different things about the use of technology in the classroom. Well, I suppose I'm going to say that all of us have always used technology in the classroom. So you may have thought of technology as something high end that we use quite recently, but we have always used technology in the classroom. If you think about it, going back to ancient history, this is an image from Egypt. We used papyrus for hieroglyphics, and they would have been used in the teaching of young people. And papyrus was a technology. The printing press was a massively revolutionary technology which enabled the production of books, and books transformed our societies around the world more profoundly than any technology until the modern day. More recently, I suppose in the 20th century, um, particularly in language teaching, audio was used, radio and records. If you look back at the history of the British Council was one of the first organizations to produce gramophone records and so on to support people in the learning of English. We had whiteboards, and before that, blackboards. That was also technology. And like all of these technologies, they have their advantages and their disadvantages. So a whiteboard is obviously a wonderful tool, or a blackboard for teachers in the classroom and for learners, but it also can have negative effects, such as making the classroom more teacher focused and more whiteboard or blackboard focused. And when I started teaching, the tape recorder was incredibly important. And the tape recorder and the use of audio in a language classroom is obviously revolutionary. It enables us to bring different voices into the classroom from different parts of the world. And it enables us to have dialogues and communication. And then some of you may remember this image of an overhead projector. This was before we had computers, and I remember creating overhead projector transparencies. And it was a useful tool, but also very awkward. Like a lot of technology, it was difficult to prepare, difficult to move, expensive. Many classrooms couldn't afford to have one. It was an awkward piece of technology, um, and shows again some of the disadvantages of technology. As a teacher, you would spend more time thinking about how to create the overhead projection than you would about your learners and about learning. And then nowadays, the modern days, we have tablets and laptops and increasingly mobile phones, which are used both in the classroom and outside the classroom by teachers and learners. So, in the future of English, it looks a lot at technology. One of the first points is about technology and learning systems. And this is a really interesting point, that English makes the use of technology easier, while technology facilitates the learning of English. So what does that mean? It means that knowledge of English, it can be quite important in utilizing technology. And going back to what I said, a lot of the technology has been invented in English-speaking countries, particularly in America. And a lot of the instructions, a lot of the background to modern technology comes from the Anglophone parts of the world, and a lot of the information is in English. So being familiar with the English language perhaps makes it easy to access and use technology and become expert in it. And at the same time, technology is also fantastic for the learning of English. Why? Because we're looking at the different skills you can use between reading and writing and listening and speaking. All of these can be facilitated through the use of technology. So technology has a special place in the learning of English. And I think compared to perhaps other subjects in the curriculum, language learning and technology has been central to language learning throughout the years. But there are major challenges with technology. So the internet is widespread in around the world, in high income countries and increasingly middle income countries. Access to the internet and use of the internet is all pervasive, both in private life and in education. But that isn't always the case. As it mentions here, 71 out of 183 countries, less than half the population had access to the internet, and that was in 2020. I would guess that is perhaps changed a little bit, even in that short period of time. I think mobile technology and the computer in our pockets, our smartphones is changing that quite rapidly. But still, the reality is large numbers of people around the world, particularly young people and particularly marginalized populations, do not have access to the internet. So as the internet and technology can enable many of us to change the way we teach, to change the way we learn, that is not the case in much of the world. And that might potentially increase the divide and increase inequity and inequality. And as I mentioned, that tends to affect those who are already most marginalized and less likely. They're going to be further excluded by and disadvantaged by the use of technology. So we do a lot of work in our programs around girls' education, and some of our research in low and middle income countries suggests that girls in many societies have less access to technology, and boys are more likely to have access to that technology. So again, technology has the potential to improve learning, but the potentially to make the learning gap even greater. And then finally, a final part of the of the future of English looking at technology was looking at artificial intelligence. And here it's talking about the massive potential of artificial intelligence to completely change teaching and learning and accelerate progress to SDG 4. That's the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal on education, focused on education. So technology and AI in particular has that potential, but AI has got multiple risks and challenges. And AI is moving much quicker than our governments and than us as individuals can in understanding it and understanding its implications, and particularly to look at regulation of AI to keep it safe and to keep us safe. So there are a few reflections that I had and from the future of English on the use of technology. And I'm just going to finish up today. It's been quite a run through the past, my own history, looking at the future. And I'm just going to make a few conclusions for this, which I hope um, we can talk about in a few minutes. So my first observation and reflection, artificial intelligence will change everything, or possibly not. So I'm a bit of a skeptic about all new technologies. I think I use technology and I think it's incredibly important for teaching and learning. But I do get concerned about hype around technology. Every new technology is going to change the world. Only some of them do. Um, every technology is going to change every person in the world. Well, not really if they don't have access to that technology. So I think artificial intelligence, from what I can see, I try to avoid it, but I can't, is having a big impact on our lives and potentially on how we teach, on and how we learn. But in much of the world, that might not be the case. And yeah, so we need to be skeptical and think about the hype around technology. Maybe it's not going to change everything like the people trying to sell it have us believe. Um, Another thing about technology and this conference and this webinar are a fabulous example of this. Technology can really change the idea of teacher communities. So if you look at the chat, you will see people from every country virtually in the world represented on this webinar. Um, our work in Teaching English website, which many of you will know through our online courses and access to resources and communities and Facebook and so on, has transformed the ability of teachers to know each other, get to know each other, get to compare and contrast each other's contexts, to learn from each other. And I think this is really, really transformational. And that's at a global level, but I also think it's important at a more local level. And in our programs, again, we work in many with isolated communities, rural communities, and communities where teachers were perhaps by themselves throughout history. And using technology such as the mobile phone, they're now able to connect with a wider group of teachers in their own countries and be able to feel part of a network. I think this has been really interesting in the last few years in particular. And during the horrible COVID times, my overriding impression was that it was actually really great for teachers, for teacher networking, teacher professional development, and perhaps less good for learners. I think we weren't quite sure what to do with the learners in the classroom in that time, and I'm not sure if there has been a lot of learning loss through that period. But it was in many respects quite positive in us as teachers in connecting each other and learning from each other. And there is, with technology, an increasing growth of learner autonomy and choice. So when you have the world in your pocket on a mobile phone, um, and when you have things like artificial intelligence, which are enable you to communicate with bots and so on, um, learners are perhaps less reliant on teachers and the classroom to learn. They can learn outside the classroom. They can choose what to learn, and often they choose to learn English because of the perceived benefits, economic and social and otherwise. So, learners are becoming more autonomous, and some people draw conclusions from that, that the teachers will become irrelevant. I don't believe that's the case. I think it's great that learners are able to access more information, to learn outside the classroom. As I mentioned, when I started school, learning was pretty much exclusively in the classroom. That was my window to the world. Nowadays, young people have a much bigger window to the world, and an overwhelming amount of information, both good and bad, which they can learn from. Um, and lastly, on the point of technology, um, there are real concerns about technology and the equity gap. And it is wonderful. I really, really believe it is wonderful what we can do with technology, reaching more people being able to connect with each other, more people being able to access learning and so and resources and information. But the problem is, what about those who can't? Or what about those who are unable to do that? Are those people going to become even more, is the education provision and their future prospects even more inequitable than it used to be? So it is very important that we look at educational access, equitable access to education technology for people around the world, and so that everyone can benefit from these opportunities, and also look at things like technology in uh, IT literacy for both teachers and students in communities where they may have not had access to technology in the past. Just to go back to some of the other predictions outside technology, the end of native speakerism, I certainly hope so. I was thinking about my own career. I learned very early on that me being a native speaker did not make me a good teacher. When I first taught as a language assistant, I was in Japan at the time. I knew within 1 week that the Japanese teachers was working with were better teachers of English than I was. I didn't really have the experience to be a good teacher. I didn't understand the learners as well as they did, both culturally and the challenges they had with their second language. So I think from the beginning of my career, I've had an awareness that native speakerism was um, slightly nonsensical. I also remember teaching in other contexts around the world. When I was in Egypt, I thought, who are the best teachers that I'm working with? They were from Egypt. They were from Poland. They were from Hungary. They weren't from the UK. And those teachers, often because they had learned English had, as a second language or additional language, had a better understanding than the native speaker teachers like myself had. That importance of multilingualism, I think there's more acknowledgement of how important, what an asset it is to be multilingual. I have to say, like many native English speakers, I'm not particularly multilingual. I've learnt a few languages through my travels, but I'm not at a great level. I speak some Japanese, some Spanish, a little bit of Arabic, but nothing, I wouldn't describe myself as multilingual. And to me, that puts me at a massive disadvantage. It's a great regret in my life that I wasn't focused on the learning of other languages and that I'm not truly multilingual. So many people in this on this call, you are multilingual, and that is a wonderful um, advantage in life, both for your understanding of the world, your ability to communicate, and for many people, for to thrive in the world, multilingualism is a real asset. And then finally, I just came back. The growth of English medium education. This is something that I find slightly concerning. Um, English medium education can work, and probably has worked for some people on this call. If you're in a well-resourced school with um, highly trained teachers, with high quality resources, with an environment at home and in the community and in school where English and other languages play a part, um, English medium education can work, or bilingual education can work. But in much of the world, those resources aren't there. The teacher development isn't there. The access to other languages, including English, outside the classroom or at home isn't there. And this can perpetuate learning loss in many countries around the world. So we should be very cautious about English medium education and its growth. And then finally, this is a teachers' conference. Nothing makes me happier than being with teachers. And whatever my job is now, I always think of myself as a teacher. It's been the pleasure of my life to be a teacher, and everything I do is about supporting them. And I still think we are absolutely critical. I don't see that changing in the coming years. Teachers from my teacher, Mrs. Black, when I was at primary school, she had a lifelong impact on me, and she was key to my success, to the way I think. And she may have had some problems like corporal punishment and and being quite a tough teacher in some respects, but she was still a wonderful teacher who had a profound influence on my life. And I think that all of you as teachers are having that influence today with your learners wherever you are. So thank you very much. I'm going to end there. I've talked about probably too many things to get your head around and to get my head around, but we'll move on and we'll take some of the questions that have come up. Um, Thank you very much for listening.
What's a closing line, Michael? The future is in the teacher's hand. I think that's amazing to finish your brilliant session with. Thank you so much for such an amazing session. It's very insightful. The future of English, the project, the publication is not new to me, but the more I think about it, the more I listen to people talk about it, the more things I learn and the more reflective I become about the future of English. Um, eh, I loved the personalized part about your experience as a primary school student and your reflection on the school, then your reflection on the teaching profession as a teacher. And I could relate really to myself, to other family members who were and are teachers now. And I think the chat was buzzing with comments. Teachers who joined us today could relate very well to their own personal experience. You'll be glad to know that we've been joined by more than 600 teachers in this slot. And the chat has been really buzzing with discussions and comments, making past reference even to other conferences where you presented on the future of English as well, Michael. So we've got lots of questions. Let's start with the first one. Let's take the questions from the chat first, then we'll go to the questions in the Q&A box. So a question for you. Did you find using a new technology in class challenging when you first used it, Michael?
Yes, I definitely did. um, I think one of the first times I used technology was when I worked in Palestine.
Mm,
And at the time, I was working with teachers in Gaza. And at that time, as today, tragically, it was very difficult for those teachers to have access and very difficult for me to have access to those teachers. So that was the first time that I used video technology, and we did video. What was it called? AV technology to connect me with the teachers. And what I learned very quickly was that I wasn't very good at it, that I knew how to train teachers in person and the interaction patterns and the structure of how to do a teacher development session, but that doing it online and or not online, but through video was completely different.
Mm,
I think my first lesson, our first session together, it was really enjoyable and brilliant to connect, but I realized that there was a different pedagogy. There were a lot of things to think about when you're not in the same room as a group of people, compared to connecting by video. So I think when you use technology, it's a learning experience. There are different things to think about, the pedagogy, the interaction patterns, and how you can use resources. It's all completely different.
mm.
So it was a wonderful learning experience. But I have to say, I wasn't very good at first, and every technology I've ever used in the classroom has been a bit of a disaster at the beginning, and then you begin to learn how to use it.
Yeah, that sounds familiar a little bit. So next question is, what is the solution for countries without technology?
Well, I think you have to use available resources. And as teachers, I think we're very resourceful. And it is quite challenging where you don't have access to technologies, I have to say. But I don't think it's a game changer. And we can teachers have always used whatever is available. They can use the students as a resource. They can use the community as a resource. They can use realia, what they have, and objects. And there are many different ways to teach English. And I don't think my teaching necessarily improved when technology was introduced. So I don't think that it's a game changer in how you teach. I think it's more important to be a good teacher, to have skills on how to manage a classroom and how to manage interaction between students and how to structure a lesson. All of this is in many respects more important than any technology, and also caring about your students and being interested in them, focused on them as learners and not yourself as a teacher. And in many respects, the technology is a useful addition to that, but not absolutely critical. In the same way that I mentioned, being a native speaker doesn't matter that much. It's actually about good teaching um, techniques and good being a good teacher. That is the critical factor.
Hmm. Not a question, but a comment that we get from Facebook for our live streaming on Facebook. And we'd like to get your thoughts on it, Michael. So, access to technology can also be divided by gender, as boys tend to get preference access over girls from families.
Yes, unfortunately, that is true. And some of the programs that we deliver, we've done some research into this and have found exactly that. In some parts of the world, boys tend to have uh, better opportunities than girls in general. So, because of concerns about safety on the internet and safety using technology, many parents tend to keep it away from girls more than boys, and they're worried, and understandably, about dangers and threats to girls and young women through the use of technology. But there are other aspects where there's a general tendency in some societies and some cultures, if not all of them, to have a tendency towards supporting the boys. Boys can often have uh, they may go to increasingly you have English medium private schools, for example. You often have more boys than girls, and the girls will be in
Mm,
the lower resource school. So it's not just about technology, but generally about females and young girls and their learning experiences. So there are real challenges there.
mm. Yes, thanks very much, Michael. Let's switch now to some questions from the Q&A from this particular session. So, a question from Rajesh: due to the advent of technology, is English or are the stakeholders ready to bring a change in itself, bearing and wearing the multicultural aspects and go beyond the standardized style to achieve sustainable development goals? So this is specifically for the readiness and the willingness of stakeholders to bring in technology.
Yeah, I mean that it it depends which stakeholders you're talking about, I suppose. So the stakeholders, one of the things I was going to mention is that education, and perhaps again when I started was about the teacher and about the learner. Education now is about multiple stakeholders there, and I think that's a positive thing. Parents are more involved in schools, in school leadership and governance. And we want to involve the wider community on what happens in schools. It's not all about teachers and learners. So um, multiple stakeholders need to be on board about the integration of technology from the education authorities to the local communities to the teaching community to the learners themselves.
Right. We've got a question here, interestingly, on English in particular, not technology, from India, from Gurleen. In India, it's very difficult to go with English language, especially in rural parts of the country. So how English can be taught and facilitated in your opinion, Michael?
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning or slightly earlier, I think the importance is good teaching, as
Hmm.
well as hopefully good curricula and good assessment and good textbooks and resources. Um, so if we're looking at, for example, rural India, where I spent some time and did some teacher development in the state of Bihar in rural India, it was really, really interesting. And the teachers were massively motivated, enthusiastic when they had the opportunity to be involved in really quality professional development experiences. I have never met teachers who learned so quickly and who applied that learning in the classroom immediately. So teacher education and quality pre-service teacher education and quality continuing professional development of teachers is absolutely critical. I think teachers everywhere have an instinctive love of their profession and they care about learning, they care about their students, but they don't always get the support they need from their authorities, ministries of education, or from their school to be able to do what they want to do, which is to teach well and for their learners to learn. But I've found teachers around the world, wherever I was, from rural India to the UK. It doesn't matter where it is. Teachers want to teach well and they want their learners to thrive, and professional development is critical to that.
Right. And you've mentioned at some point that you're generally skeptical about implementing digital tools in the classroom. So am I, by the way. And there is a question about any benefits you can see, Michael, of not using technology in the classroom.
Yes, um, I'm really, really keen on technology
Hmm.
to help us. As I mentioned, I think it like for this kind of thing, it's absolutely wonderful. We've got all of us networking, learning, people around the world. It's absolutely fantastic. In my private life and in my work, technology is absolutely central. But in the classroom, I have some skepticism. And I think, as I mentioned when we were talking about um, my first using technology in the classroom for the first time, I think teachers can become over focused on the technology and forget the learners and forget learning. And the purpose of the class is to learn English. It isn't necessarily to learn how to use technology, which is learned elsewhere. So I think sometimes the technology can take the focus away from what you're trying, from your learning outcomes. What are you trying to achieve? And so it can be a distraction. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I am an old man and I've been in education for half the lifetime of the British Council. I think there's a new generation of people coming through, young people, young teachers. They Technology was so integrated in their lives from the moment of their birth, unlike me. It's kind of come in stages in my life, and each time trying to understand the next development. For many young people, young teachers, this is entirely instinctive, and they don't have that kind of um, awkwardness around technology that I have. That every time something comes in, you think, "Oh my God, it's another thing that I have to learn," and it becomes a bit overwhelming. But for new teachers and young people, that's less of a challenge.
Michael, our time is up, sadly. Thanks very much again for a wonderful plenary session. It was such an insightful thing to start our celebration today with. A lot of thanks to my colleagues working behind the scenes, our moderators, Kirstine and Co. On Facebook, and Melissa and Joe on Zoom. Thank you very much for making this possible. We'll be back in 15 minutes for the next webinar, which will be about mindfulness and education. Enjoy the rest of your day with us and enjoy celebrating a wonderful World Teachers Day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ella. Happy World Teachers Day.